Interview with Richard Nixon, 1984.
Do you think that the Kennedys are American royalty?
Oh, in their minds, certainly. And I think that tells part of the story. And in the minds of many of the media, yes. Nothing else can explain the way that Teddy Kennedy, despite the defeats he has suffered and despite his background, is still a very formidable potential candidate for President of the United States. It's the Kennedy mystique. It's still there. It's going to last as long as one of them's living.
Are you impressed by people who have money?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, most of them are very boring because that's all they want to talk about. I mean, to me, one of the most boring things to do is to go to Palm Springs or Palm Beach or Newport and see the so-called beautiful people who either inherited money and some have earned it, showing off their gowns and their furs and their diamonds and their jewelry and talking of nothing but money and food and houses and sometimes a little sex. But it's a bore.
It's his longtime associate, Frank Gannett. Gannett had been a White House fellow and had later worked with Mr. Nixon on some of his books. Because we'd never heard a former president speak so candidly on the record, we purchased the broadcast rights to an hour and a half of the 38 hours Mr. Nixon had recorded on videotape. At the start of each taping session, Mr. Nixon knew what areas were to be covered, but at no time was he given the questions in advance. Also, as we said last week, Mr. Nixon was paid a fee in advance of the taping, not by us, but by the company which produced the tapes. He also owns a share of the profits from the worldwide sale of the television memoirs. Again, a word of caution. As in last week's segment, the former president used expletives. Again, we decided not to delete them.
One of the standard operating interpretations about Richard Nixon is that you're obsessed by money, by wealth, by the lack of it or the lack of enough of it, or impressed with it in other people. Do you see that at all in yourself?
Oh, if I were, I'd have some. My income is relatively modest, and I don't have any, except for what I write, because I don't take honorariums, and I'm not a member of any board or any of that sort of thing. I'm very comfortable because my books have been very successful, and my real estate investments, the only thing I've ever invested in, have come out better than most.
Are you impressed by people who have money?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, most of them are very boring because that's all they want to talk about. I mean, to me, one of the most boring things to do is to go to Palm Springs or Palm Beach or Newport and see the so-called beautiful people who either inherited money and some have earned it, showing off their gowns and their furs and their diamonds and their jewelry and talking of nothing but money and food and houses and sometimes a little sex. But it's a bore.
What was it like running against the Kennedy political operation and the Kennedy money in 1960?
It was rough because they were smart, they were rich, they were ruthless. And by ruthless, I mean they do anything to win. They play hardball. I mean, they may play softball out in the White House lawn over there, but it's hardball. Or it may be touch football on the playgrounds, but it's tackle football all the way.
Could you see the Kennedy money at work against your operation?
Well, one rather humorous example. In those days, and thank God those days are gone, the black vote was greatly influenced by black preachers. And in those days, each party used to bid for the support of the black preachers, figuring if you get the preachers, they go out and tell their congregation, you get the black vote. Well, Len Hall was our campaign chairman. He was from New York State. And of course, this kind of thing of buying the black preachers, as they say, we didn't do that in California because we were up to speed with regard to what was done back here in the East. But Len Hall, apparently they knew they had been doing that for years in New York. So he made an attempt to subsidize some of the black preachers and so forth, with contributions and so forth, in order to get their support. And he had a pretty good fund to do that. And he came to me one time, he says, "My God, I've never seen anything like it." I said, "I've paid these fellows more than I ever got before, and Joe Kennedy's come in there and raised me every time. We didn't get one of them."
Tom Wicker, the liberal columnist, wrote some years ago, "Nobody knows to this day, or ever will, whom the American people really elected president in 1960. Under the prevailing system, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated, but it is not at all clear that this was really the will of the people, or, if so, by what means and margin that will was expressed." Do you think that you were elected president of the United States in 1960?
Well, many objective observers believe that I was. I'm not going to sit here and say that I believe that I was, because I haven't the evidence to prove that I was not, or was. I will say this, however. There was no question, and these are facts, that there was immense fraud in Chicago, and it was all on that side, not on our side. And there was only 8,000 votes difference in us in Illinois between us. So it's only a shift of 4,000 votes, and I would have won Illinois. Then I needed only one other state. Could have been Missouri, could have been South Carolina. A shift of 12,000 votes out of 70 million would have meant my being elected rather than Kennedy. The other state, however, where the major charges of fraud was made was in Johnson's state of Texas. And there were many precincts in heavily Johnson areas that twice as many voters voted as were on the rolls. In fact, there was a famous story that Johnson used to tell of himself. Kennedy kidded Johnson on occasion, and Johnson didn't particularly like it, of being landslide Johnson. That was because when Johnson went to the Senate the first time, he won by a very, very small amount. And he won, they thought, by some hanky-panky, because he played hardball too. And then Johnson told this story about a little boy sitting on a curb down in a South Texas town. The little boy was crying. Somebody came up to him and said, "Manuel, why are you crying?" He said, "I'm crying because my father was here Tuesday. He didn't come to see me." "Oh, but Manuel, your father's been dead for 10 years. "I know, but he was here Tuesday and voted for Lyndon Johnson. They didn't come to see me." So, in other words, the voting of dead people and the rest, it occurred. But people say, if it did occur, why didn't you do as President Eisenhower and many others urged me to do? Why did you contest it? Well, there were clear reasons. I really didn't have any doubt about contesting it. Not really. My heart told me to do it. My head said no. It said no for this fundamental reason. One, it would be the United States would be without a president for almost a year before the challenges in Illinois and Texas could have been run through. And there was a good chance that we could finance it. Eisenhower was willing to raise money from his friends in order to support that challenge, and I turned it down. The second reason was, and this was because of my travels abroad, I'd been to Latin America, I'd been to Africa, and I'd been to countries in the Far East that were just starting down the democratic path. The United States is an example of the democratic system. In those countries, an election means very little. You have an election, you either fix it, or if it comes out against you, you have a coup and overthrow them, or charge corruption, what have you. If in the United States an election were found to be fraudulent, it would mean that every pipsqueak in every one of these countries, if he lost an election, would simply bring a fraud charge and have a coup. So I felt that under the circumstances, one, the United States couldn't afford to have a vacuum in leadership for that period of time without knowing who was president, and two, even though we were to win it, the cost of world opinion, the effect on democracy in the broadest sense would be detrimental.
So you do think it is possible, without reaching a judgment, that you were, in fact, elected the 35th President of the United States in November of 1960?
Oh, yes, it was possible. And I think President Kennedy felt it was possible, too. I remember when he came to see me right after the election, when we were both in Florida at the Key Biscayne Hotel. The first words that he spoke after the press left and so forth, he said, "Well, I guess it's hard to tell who won this election." And I said, "Well, it's pretty clear that it's over now." I think he was rather relieved when I said that. That meant that, in effect, I was telling him I was not going to contest it.
Do you think that the average politician wouldn't have cried for a recount till the cows come home? Do you think most politicians look at it that way and do the right thing?
I think they might have. I think if the shoe had been on the other foot, that Kennedy might have contested it. But I don't know.
Do you remember how you heard about his death? For one generation of Americans, just like for an earlier one, everybody remembers where they were when FDR died, and in your generation, in my generation, I think everybody remembers where they were when they heard about President Kennedy's death. Do you remember?
Oh, yes, I was in a taxi cab, and a man ran over from the curb and said to the cab driver, "Do you have a radio in your car?" I said, "No." He said, "President Kennedy's just been shot." Well, we didn't have a radio, and the cab went on, and all the way back in took another 20, 25 minutes before we got to the apartment. I wondered, what in the world has happened? So we got into the apartment, and I immediately got on the phone. I got J. Edgar Hoover in the line. And I said, "What happened? Who was it? One of the right-wing nuts?" And Hoover responded, "No, it was a communist." He never said communist. He always said communist. And that's how I learned it.
What was your personal reaction when you found that President Kennedy was in fact dead?
Well, it was the reaction of, I think, most everybody. That first, one of sadness, profound sadness, the tragedy of it all, a man so young with so much life ahead, the tragedy for him, his family, for his supporters and friends, for the free world generally, the tragedy for the country that an assassination could take place and be allowed to take place. That certainly was something that ran through my mind. I didn't have any feeling that there, but for the grace of God, go on. I had, after all, I'm very fatalistic about life in general. And as far as I'm concerned, I always feel that what you have to do is to live life to the hilt. You have to, I always start out each day figuring this day may be the last, and live it right to the hilt. If you shortchange life, you shortchange yourself. You never look back, but always go forward. I think President Kennedy, John Kennedy, felt the same way. And the tragedy that he had to have his life snuffed short, to an extent, I think is balanced with the fact that he lived it to the hilt.
A lot has been written and spoken and even sung about the Kennedy style, that sort of collection of events and attitudes and conduct, which for one brief shining moment created Camelot on the Potomac. One might expect that you have a slightly different approach to the Kennedy style. How would you describe the Kennedy style?
Well, I would describe it first as being suave, smooth, debonair, and that appealed, of course, to many in the media who are more, frankly, suckers for style than average people, for that matter. He was more than simply a suave, smooth intellectual. They're Ivy League intellectual. He was Ivy League, but he was also Boston Irish, and that was a big difference. I think the fact that John Kennedy very much approved of the designation that was given to him by Joe Alsop tells us one of the reasons why he had this charisma. He was a Stevenson with balls, and therefore he was one that attracted the people who wanted a young, courageous man in the presidency, and yet one who was smooth and graceful. Basically, that's the mark of royalty.
Do you think that the Kennedys are American royalty?
Oh, in their minds, certainly. And I think that tells part of the story. And in the minds of many of the media, yes. Nothing else can explain the way that Teddy Kennedy, despite the defeats he has suffered and despite his background, is still a very formidable potential candidate for President of the United States. It's the Kennedy mystique. It's still there. It's going to last as long as one of them's living.
Do you think that Americans long for the grandeur and the pageantry and the security of a royal family? Do they look for that in leaders?
Some do, yes.
Is
Whether
that
a
healthy?
majority do or not. I don't think it's particularly unhealthy. It depends on how it's really defined. I would say that generally speaking, you find that many Americans that they want their leaders to be somebody different from themselves. The present day politician thinks that the way to lead is to be like the other people, just to be like the man next door. Well, people aren't going to vote for the man next door. They want their leader to be somebody who is different, bigger than life, different from themselves, not one that is like them.
Some of the Kennedy people, in fact, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Is the man who gave it the phrase, have said that the Nixon presidency was an imperial presidency. Was that your attempt to give the American people that aspect of a royal family in your kind of leadership?
No, I would say the Kennedy presidency is the one that qualifies as the imperial presidency more than any other. They really know how to use power, and they used it ruthlessly. Well, let's use a couple of examples. You heard about wiretapping, and people would think that the first time anybody was ever wiretapped was in our administration. Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people, but the highest number of wiretaps, even higher than those that were necessarily applied for national security purposes in the Korean War, and those that were applied for national security purposes in the Vietnam War, the highest number of national security so-called wiretaps was in 1963 by Bobby Kennedy when he was Attorney General for John F. Kennedy. And they used the wiretaps for what I would say were questionable national security purposes. For example, they wiretapped one reporter that they found was writing a book on Marilyn Monroe that might have some derogatory comments about Kennedy's in it. I don't think you can find any of that in our case. Some of ours should not have been applied, but we tried to have a national security justification for them. Leaks, for example, of classified material was the primary reason we had for wiretapping.
And on the issue of bugging the White House, Mr. Nixon has already claimed Lyndon Johnson, among others, did it. And it wasn't just the Oval Office that Mr. Johnson bugged.
He had everything taped. He even had a taping system under the bed in the White House. I don't know why, but he did. But he had meetings in his bedroom, so that didn't make any difference. I don't know whether he had any in the bathroom, but sometimes Johnson, who loved to sometimes embarrass some whippersnapper or somebody who thought he was pretty smart from the East, he received them while he's sitting on the toilet. He just loved to do that sort of thing. He wasn't a favorite of the Eastern establishment press, which is the most powerful press. He wasn't their favorite in terms of his Texas background. They thought he was basically a bit on the crude side, sort of a corn pone and so forth.
Wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a very down-to-earth fellow. I liked him. I mean, I don't believe that somebody has to speak with a so-called British accent and all that sort of thing. That sappy accent that many of our foreign service people put on. Where they sort of burp out their words in order to prove that they are so smart. No, Johnson was what he was. And one thing, incidentally, before I get to that always used to me about Johnson. Johnson used to love to sort of stick it to, actually became president in his own right, to some of these, what he called fancy Dan bureaucrats, or from the State Department, or some of the other agencies, and from the press, by deliberately using very bad grammar. Now, Johnson knew good grammar. He wasn't that badly educated. He knew it, but he used very bad grammar. He'd mispronounce things like, rather than saying hors d'oeuvre, he'd say hors d'oeuvre, and he'd watch him cringe. But that was not an unusual trait sometimes for people from the Midwest and the others who have a resentment toward these people that wear their education on their sleeves. I remember Bill Jenner. He was the senator from Indiana, very conservative, ultra-conservative. But he had been first in his class at Indiana Law School. He had a marvelous understanding of the English language, but he deliberately would use bad grammar on occasion. I recall the day that Averell Harriman announced he was going to run for president of the United States in 1956. Several of the senators were sitting with me. I was vice president at the time in a little special dining room we have for members of the Senate there as stags, having lunch. And just as we were finishing, in came Bill Jenner. And he sort of slouched down into a chair and sat down. He said, "I just seen Harriman on the TV. And somebody said, well, what was he like, Bill? What do you think of him? Just, he's thin, boys. Thin as piss on a rock. Well, Eddie, that was Bill Jenner. That was Lyndon Johnson. It turned some people off, but that's the way they were. And I kind of admired them for being what they were.
Largely because of your tapes, you have become known as the man who sort of brought the four-letter word to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Given some of Johnson's tremendously colorful and vital, but undeniably crude language, and the language of the presidents you have known, does it gall you that you have been lumbered with this dubious distinction?
No, nothing galls me. I mean, obviously the Johnson tapes will be expurgated. The Kennedy tapes will be expurgated, and they should be. Let me tell you why.
Should yours be?
Of course. Let me tell you why. We have to realize that, first, let me begin by saying, every president I have known swore privately. Eisenhower did, all the rest. None of them that I have known swore publicly. Now people say, but that's hypocritical. And the point is, not at all. If I may be very direct, you don't go to the bathroom in the living room. Presidents, like anybody else, are human. And profanity comes forth when you're frustrated, and believe me, in that job sometimes you do get frustrated. I remember already we've talked about how President Kennedy was blowing his stack about what happened to the Bay of Pigs, and boy, he used words and I've never heard in that place before or since. But I understood it. I would have been frustrated too, and I would have sworn about being missed. Eisenhower, I remember the time that he was so angry as we got the election returns in 1956, and found that although we had won in a landslide, we had failed to win the House and the Senate. And he says, those goddamn moss-back Republicans, that's the problem. We've got to have a modern Republican Party. That's the way he would talk. Now look, why don't we have all of that out so that everybody can see? And the answer is that while presidents are human, people expect them to be more than human. People have images of their presidents, of their leaders. They want to keep those images. I want to keep them. I want a president to be able to have a private life, even to be able to swear now and then, to let his hair down. But from the standpoint of people, it's very important that they see the best side of the man.
On the subject of Spiro Agnew, Mr. Nixon said that Agnew got a bum rap because whatever he was accused of had occurred before he was vice president.
If you felt it was a bum rap, why'd you let him go? Or why didn't you stop him from going?
There was nothing that we could do to stop him with the problems that I had at that particular time. There was nothing I could do for him. I only wish I'd been stronger. If I had been, I would have stopped him.
Barbara Walters said that you were one of the sexiest men she'd ever met. What do you think led her to that conclusion?
Well, maybe she doesn't know many other men.
Henry Kissinger said that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Is politics a more sexy or a more highly sexed profession than others? Maybe this goes on all the time.
Well, I guess quite a few politicians have been swordsmen, but that doesn't mean that a lot of businessmen haven't been, and even college professors now and then have a little hanky-panky.
In 1968, as you've said when you were considering whether or not to run for president, Tricia said that the reason you should run was that if you didn't, you wouldn't have anything to live for, and you've said that that was true at the time. What do you have to live for now?
But what a former president can contribute is, I would say, marginal. I mean, we get a lot of guff to the effect that, well, everybody's hanging on every word that a former president says, and former presidents are great national assets, and that's all a bunch of nonsense. It's not really true. A former president can contribute, not because he's a former president, but if he knows something a little bit more than somebody else. Having been president, it may give you temporarily a forum, but once they find out there's nothing up here, or you've got nothing to say, they quit paying attention to you. So I would say that as long as I can keep current with events and have something to say that could make a difference, I may influence the course of events. Once I decide that I no longer have the energy or maybe the understanding, to comment on current events in a way that could influence the course of events, influence decisions made by the President, Secretary of State, and whatever. Once that occurs, then I will quietly recede from the political scene. But as far as the future is concerned, I have, again, a rather philosophical and almost fatalistic view about it. Walter Annenberg, our former ambassador to England, once told me shortly after I resigned the presidency, and I was down a bit, understandably, and he was trying to buck me up. And he said, remember, life is 99 rounds, 99 rounds, and whoever's standing at the end is going to win. Well, I'm still standing at 70, and I expect to stand again, I trust, for a few more years, maybe 99 rounds. 99 rounds.